Our next presenter is Annmaree Jackson from Griffith University. Annmaree, I know you have a number of people you're going to introduce who are helping you with this. So let me just say that Annmaree is a policy officer in the research ethics and integrity space and supports researchers to conduct their research involving humans responsibly, ethically, and with integrity. I will hand over to you now, Annmaree.
Okay, thank you, Gordon, and good morning, everyone, or afternoon now. I would also like to recognise the traditional owners, the Jayabal and the Jarowair people of the Toowoomba area, from where I'm currently situated today, as keepers of the ancient knowledge and whose culture and customs continue to nurture this land. I also pay respect to elders past, present and future. So just to let you know, Gordon, yes, this has been a collaboration, but I will be solely presenting today. So I hope that that's okay. My session today is looking at around publicly available data and when we use that in research, when that might require ethical review. So we know from our panel sessions last year at the HREC training day, that both researchers and some HRECs were sometimes a little confused around where the research protocols that involve this kind of existing data sets that have been sourced from the internet and or social media would fit. So additionally, they might be a little bit unclear on where to seek guidance on these types of protocols. We know the national statement has been updated recently in 2018 to include some further information, but there's still a little bit more clarity that we might be able to provide here. So within our office, we frequently receive questions around whether this kind of work would require ethical review or whether it might be exempt from review, whether researchers have to go and get consent from everybody that's on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever they're seeking their data from. If they're going to remove the identifiers, they think it's not identifiable data. But as we know, that's not correct. It's potentially re-identifiable data. And they quite often query whether or not they can't just download the information and analyze it. So in responding to those types of queries, I always say it depends. And we like to take a look at what they'd like to do and what they need to achieve. So last year we kind of shared our thoughts and presented where we're up to in developing a resource to assist HRECs and researchers with this task. So I'm pleased to now take you through the final flowchart that we're now using. So to set the scene for this presentation, we acknowledge that the internet and social media can be used for recruitment of participants and also collecting data prospectively, like via survey tools, etc. However, we're not going to be looking at those. We're going to focus more around the framework aligned with the existing data sets, so information that's being taken from the internet and social media. So let's dive in. If the data is already in the public domain, does it make sense that an ethical review should now be required for the reuse of this research? So it's a reasonable question, but I think one that doesn't have an obvious answer. So in some cases it can be straightforward. However, more likely than not, using data from the internet or social media can sometimes raise some of these non-obvious challenges in adhering to existing ethical principles. And that's where we hope that our flowchart will be able to assist everyone in navigating some of these principles. I'll just get my slide on. So we've been, I'll just go back one. Okay, so building on the work of Dr. Leanne Townsend and Professor Claire Wallace from the UK, we revised their social media research guide to form a framework around accessing and using data from the internet or social media, and we put it into the Australian context. So this incorporates aspects of the national statement and the Australian Code for the responsible conduct of research and local legislative requirements. So we've tried to keep this to a 2-page flowchart to keep it fairly clear and easy to use. And we've outlined common key aspects of research in this domain and the associated ethical concerns. And so we've grouped these around the requirement for ethical review, legal and compliance, privacy and risk, informed consent, and data reuse and dissemination. So the idea is that the research project is tested against all of these ethical considerations in the sections rather than kind of picking and choosing some of these which may seem relevant. So I've taken some snippets from the flowchart and we'll just sort of run through some of these fairly quickly. So we've started with the national statement's requirement around whether or not the work would actually require ethical review. So we pose questions to determine if the activity is considered human research with exit points to reference material for quality assurance and evaluation activities as required. And then we've also provided links through to the national statement and the NHMRC resource guides as required. So the flowchart's working on the premise outlined in the national statement that research activity plus human data equals some level of ethical review. However, we note that most of the internet social media protocols are likely to be referred to a negligible or low risk review pathway that's been established by an institution. So exceptions to this may be when the research project invokes some chapters in the national statement that require full review, or if a waiver for the requirement of consent has been requested, or it's not been requested, but we've identified that an ethical reviewer, by an ethical reviewer, that we actually need one. And we've established kind of a chair review and approval process for negligible and low risk projects and referral to the HREC where this involves the health related data and may have section 95 and 95A Privacy Act implications. So the next section that we look at is around legal and compliance. So when using data from social media, we ask researchers to consider the terms and conditions of the platform from where they're taking the data. Firstly, does the platform permit researchers to use the data from their site for the purposes of research? Most do, but we note that some of them may not. And this may require a rethink of the research design by the research team. So at Griffith, we're lucky to have a copyright officer who assists our researchers in navigating these terms and conditions that they propose to use. And it may be worth checking in your institution if you have someone who can also assist in this capacity, as this can be quite an onerous task for someone who infrequently works in the space and might not have a legal background. The next ones we look at are the privacy and risk. And this has got several considerations, and we've consolidated these into three main areas around the expectations of privacy, vulnerability and sensitivity of the data. So normally when we post to Facebook or Twitter, we might not be thinking that the information we post is going to be used for researchers. So yes, we understand that we're putting it out there for others to see. It's in the public, potentially not in the context of it being research though. So we asked researchers to consider what the privacy expectations of the social media or content author might be. For some platforms, such as Twitter, we would consider this to be very public. Individuals have followers and it's expected that what you say in posts would be viewed and retweeted, which can be favourable in some cases. However, some platforms have different privacy settings. So Facebook, for example, will have different levels of privacy, and users may expect if they post in a closed forum that has administrator access, that their post will be private between the group members. So the role of the researcher may also come into play in this kind of scenario, and whether they wish to overtly or covertly observe and record what is occurring within that group. So vulnerability is a bit of a hot topic at the moment. We know the national statement's undertaking revisions to chapters that pertain to the vulnerability of particular populations and participant groups. However, with online research that is conducted at a distance, things become somewhat blurred when we're unable to determine the identity of that social media user. So how do we know they're over 18 years of age, or if they're a child or a young person? How would you know if they have fully understood the consent process? And so the answer is either you can't, or it's really difficult to establish. So therefore, this kind of needs to be taken into consideration in terms of the overall risk of conducting a project online, and consideration of whether a face-to-face project may be better suited to safeguard the individuals for the topic that's being considered. The reuse of online data in new contexts and to new audiences also warrants some consideration around whether anonymity and confidentiality can be maintained. As we know, it's really quite simple to re-identify and link information So we know researchers are required to exercise care in handling confidential and sensitive information used in or arising from a research project. That's part of the Australian Code. But whether a topic is considered sensitive can also be subjective, and involving an independent process such as ethical review can assist in ensuring that ethical considerations are also afforded to this aspect of the project. So when we're looking at human research in general, there are three main positions on informed consent. You already have it from previously conducted research that sought consent for extended or unspecified future research. You're going to seek it either through a prospective data collection consent process or a prospective process where you're going to be contacting those social media users and getting their consent, or you're going to seek a waiver of the requirement for consent. So when we have brought up waiving the requirement for consent in the past, we've heard gasps and so like, oh, you know, can you do that? We kind of feel that it doesn't necessarily have to be a scary process for either researchers or HRECs, given there are guidelines provided within the national statement. So we know that only a HREC can grant the waiver of consent for research that uses personal information in medical research, personal health research, or research that aims to expose illegal activity. However, other review bodies can grant waivers of consent for research such as negligible and low risk, and they might be through the pathways established through the institution. So there is criteria that needs to be satisfied, which is outlined in section 2.3.10 of the national statement, and institutions are responsible for making a summary of the research projects for which it has waived consent publicly available, so like in annual reports. And this is to maintain the public confidence in the research process. So in the final part of it, we're looking at the reuse and data dissemination. So in looking in that data that's been sourced from the internet or social media, we look at a number of ethical considerations, and these are grouped around identifiability or re-identifiability of the data and the individuals therein, and maintaining good research practices through sharing data. And that's a responsibility outlined in the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. So when looking at the identifiability of individuals in published research findings, we prompt researchers and HRECs to consider if the social media users could be identified by individual data extracts, if they're reproduced in dissertations, publications, and presentations. So we know if you plug in various words, you can quite often link it back. What are the requirements of the social media platform for the reproducibility of the data? For example, is there a requirement to repost that, say, tweet or Facebook message in its original form and attribute it to the original poster? Or can you actually take that and paraphrase it? And could exposing the data in the new context or to a new audience place a social media user at a potential risk? So for example, could they be at risk of embarrassment or damage to their reputation, to their employment, or any other opportunities? So further consideration also needs to be applied to whether an individual could be re-identified by the way in which the data is published. And this comes down to looking at, the units of data that are going to be used when publishing. Could they be easily linked and individuals re-identified? We know of some, high profile cases where that's occurred. And what would be required for the research design? Example, do you actually need to put the whole say Instagram image plus the text, or could you just do the text, or could you just do an analysis on the theme and report that? So depending on the research methodology that's proposed, looking at the least kind of identifiable method there. So it's easy to see here why we can't apply a one-size-fits-all approach, because we need to consider what the methodological approach is, the research questions and the aims of the research, together with the remainder of the ethical aspects. So funding and other collaborative requirements, they're now kind of requiring that researchers comply with the Australian Code. When you're looking at that, Principle 3 is indicating transparency and declaring interest in reporting methodology, data and findings, and requiring researchers to share and communicate their methodology, data and findings openly, responsibly and accurately. And consideration given to how the data will be made available for the use of other researchers. So I guess letting them know it doesn't have to be just all plonked onto a public space, that can be via mediated access, and just maintaining that respect and looking after the participants and their identifiability. So I guess the take-home message from this presentation is we treat data the same as everything else under the National Statement Guidelines. If it's a research activity that involves human data, we do treat it to some level of ethical review. The information involving data sourced from the internet can be referred to a negligible or low risk review pathway, and we find that's where most of them will go. You can request to waive a requirement for consent, and it may not be problematic if you've got a robust local process in place. Using data from the internet can sometimes raise non-obvious challenges in adhering to existing ethical principles. However, we hope that our flowchart can assist you and your researchers and your HREC to navigate these challenges. So I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge my collaborators on this project. Kim Madison, who is our manager within our team, Professor Eleanor Milligan, our chair of our Griffith University HREC, and Dr. Gary Allen, our senior policy officer, and also to Dr. Leanne Townsend and Professor Claire Wallace, who did a wonderful research project around this and have granted permission for us to build on their work and share this today. So that's it from me.
Oh, thank you very much, Annmaree. I'd like to say I have something sensible to ask you, but I don't really, principally because I guess it's one of these situations where it looks like an incredibly valuable tool, but one would have to try and use it in practice just to work through it to see how it's, how one went at the end. I mean, I'm interested with the social media because if you can extract data freely, it is an ethical question of why can't you use it for your own purposes anyway, because it's there and presumably people wished it to be there. But I take your point about it going through low and negligible risk pathways, excuse me. Annmaree, I guess one of the only questions I had is in terms of, the construction of that flowchart. You've obviously done some interviews and focus groups to develop it. And I guess the question is, have you tested it? Is it sort of validated? Does it work for your ethics committee?
We've recently, it's built on the research that's been undertaken in the UK and then contextualised to the Australian framework. I did my honours thesis around this topic. So I've done interviews through that space and done subsequent workshops and sought feedback. So we believe it's working for the things that we've done within the office, but we've just more broadly shared it with our committee. So it's, we're going to write up a couple of test cases and apply it to some of the more well-known test cases and publish that through a HREC newsletter. So we'll be putting it through that robust testing. But I'm also, I've got a link to it there, so people are welcome to take it, use it, provide feedback on it. And, my details are there. So I would really like to see some feedback on it if people have something, if it's working, if it's not. As I said at the beginning, it's not meant to be kind of bits and pieces take. It's meant to be like choosing it all in its entirety, going through. When you see it in its entirety, it kind of flows in and out and it's got direction. So it kind of takes you on a journey. Yes, the researchers I've provided it to have said it's been extremely helpful for them and helped them navigate the space. So, yeah.
And I think with the use of data and information, it's important just to be taken on that journey and work through it. Just a point Eleanor has pointed out, social media data is often not freely available data, and you do need to sign up and agree to platform terms and conditions to access these, and the terms and conditions often limit research. So therefore, there is a need for oversight when using data from these sources. Annmaree, and I think it does. I think it's excellent. Have you tested this with the Privacy Office of the Information Commissioner, for example?
We have run this past our legal team and our copyright officer through Griffith University. So I believe it is sufficiently robust, but I haven't sent it through the OIAC.
Oh, I was just curious because I'm sure it is robust, and I'm sure your legal team have provided advice, but I think that would be the next step. And the reason I mention that is that, as one of our speakers pointed out the other day, sometimes there are no guidelines and ethics committees, for example, have to lead the way. And so the use of this, for example, might be an excellent way to move forward. and then to be codified at some point by the Office of the Information Commissioner. So it's just a thought that once validated, it might be a really useful place to take it.
Yeah, that's really good feedback. Thanks, Gordon.
Annmaree, we may stop there. There aren't any questions from the floor, and noting it's 12:30 and 10 minutes over time, for which I apologise. But it's been a really fascinating session. And